University. His research has been numerous contributions using large-scale computational modeling and advanced neuroimaging to infer circuitry in the visual cortex. He has received numerous awards, the NSF Career Award, Fellow IEEE, and his EIC, the IEEE TNSRG. He's also a very nice guy. Paul?
Okay, let's see if the AV, I can get that to work. I just switched it, but it doesn't look like it's... Can you switch the AV? Anyway, I guess I'll start. Thanks for inviting me, Mike. So what I want to talk about today is basically an approach for utilizing attentional orienting as a way to label the world and construct what I think are interesting types of brain-machine interfaces that we could exploit in the future to kind of aid in information delivery. So, let's see if I can get this working here. So the talk you see is, I've mentioned this notion of the aha moment. So everybody here probably has had one, if not several, classic aha moments. You're sitting on your couch and all of a sudden you come up with this great experiment that you can do in your lab, or you remember, the name of your school teacher in kindergarten. And typically when we think of these aha moments, we think of it as there's some kind of endogenous thought that pops, let's say, from our subconscious into our conscious. And what happens is typically we orient our attention to that particular thought. There's often a change in our arousal state, and we start to ponder and essentially direct cognitive resources to processing that endogenous thought. Now, when I say aha moment, I mean it even in a much more general way, one in where we're not just essentially focusing on endogenous thoughts, but also thoughts that can be triggered by exogenous stimuli. So there's a rumor going around, there's some poker players in the audience, and so a poker player who all of a sudden pulls this hand is immediately going to have an aha moment. Namely, what they see is basically a no-lose hand, and there's a value associated with that. And so orienting essentially their attention to this particular stimulus, coming up with a strategy on how to best make and plan a move relative to the context of the other players, that's an aha moment. Another might be if one is in an environment and one sees a potential threat. And typically what happens is there's an autonomic response, our arousal goes up, we orient to that threat, and we come up with a plan of action for how we're going to deal with that threat. And if you're like me and you came without your spouse to Budapest, you realize that in order to optimize a cost function like my happiness when I get home, I'm going to buy my wife a present as I walk down the street. And so I have in mind certain things that she likes, and then I see something in, let's say, my peripheral vision, and I know it's something that she might find of interest, and I orient to it. So make a decision. And so this idea of attentional orienting is really fundamental to how the brain operates. It allows us not just to orient cognitive resources to make a decision or deal with a problem, but also labels us to switch and multitask in ways where we can minimize, let's say, prediction errors. We can learn based on the current state of the world and what we orient to. So it's a pretty important function that the brain has. What I want to do is, before I explain how we might exploit this in a brain-machine interface, I want to get into a little bit more of the neuroscience. So I always like to start this as a day on the street in New York City by Columbia University, though I tried to cross the street here, and I think Budapest is just as a valid context. So usually you start off by saying, all right, so student gets up in the morning, they're drowsy. By Columbia University, there's this big street, Broadway, but more or less when students have to go to class, they're crossing these side streets. So all of a sudden, a car coming down, a red car that's task relevant, meaning that this student has to cross the street, essentially be attentive to this car. They can ignore these distractor cars because they're irrelevant for their task of getting to class. That hopefully orients their attention because they have to react to that and make a decision when or whether or not to cross. Now, if we could imagine recording activity, brain activity from this individual, let's say we're using EEG as a modality, we might expect this kind of anomalous or relatively rare oddball event to evoke what's typically classically referred to as the P300. So the P300, a positivity, happens about 300 milliseconds after the stimulus, kind of gets a peak near 400 or 500 milliseconds and is positive in terms of its deflection relative to a classic reference. And so that event, that evoked response, happens in this particular case. So let's imagine later on our student goes and grabs a coffee at Starbucks. They're a little bit more alert, engaged in the task, and the same event happens. And we could record, for instance, that event and that subsequent EEG signal, and we see that it's a little bit different, okay? And let's say even later on, the same thing happens, exactly the same, once again, a little bit different. So we know EEG is a noisy signal. I think we all agree. Now, noise comes in different flavors. Some is noise due to poor recording or some artifacts from the world, but there's also unexplained variants that might actually have important underlying physiological and behavioral consequences. So one thing that's interesting, and there's evidence of this in the literature, is that this variability, or at least some fraction of this variability on a trial-to-trial basis, of evoked responses like the P300 can be attributed to the state of arousal of the individual. Now, usually that's ignored when one is looking in the ERP literature because one averages across all these trials. They get, people will get signal to noise in the EEG by using something like averaging. But here, what we want to consider is, can we do something else? Instead of averaging across these trials, can we actually look specifically at this variability as a signature of arousal state and potentially giving us insight into this attentional orienting, since we believe that that's coupled to arousal. So a little bit more on kind of the basis of this. It turns out that in humans, the arousal, autonomic arousal, and in particular arousal within the brain is believed to be controlled through norepinephrine in a tiny little nucleus, the locus coeruleus, which is in the dorsal pons. And what's interesting about that is even though it's only about 30,000 neurons, it actually projects, that locus coeruleus projects all over the brain. And therefore it has a very much of a systemic effect when it is activated. Now, there have been quite a bit of work trying to link activity in the locus coeruleus to different other types of physiological responses that are related to arousal. And some work years ago looked at, in particular, pupil dilation and responses of the locus coeruleus neurons and how they're actually reflected in the diameter of the pupil. And this is actually a picture that was in a review article, and everybody always talks about the fact, well, it was never really published, but recently Josh Gold from UPenn really did a very kind of rigorous study in non-human primates showing that at least part of the variance of the activity in locus coeruleus is expressed in pupil dilation. And that's going to be important in a few minutes. So when we think about how we're linking arousal, attention, physiological and behavioral responses, we also want to think about performance, behavior, right? So if we go back to our original student with these three different arousal states, we can actually also map that to a classic behavioral curve or psychometric curve, which is called the Yerkes-Dodson curve. And this is really within the psychology literature, but it showed that, actually you can't see it here, but the x-axis is arousal. So the task performance, so if I have a given task that I'm supposed to be executing, as my arousal level increases, I get better at that task up to a point where I can eventually get worse at the task because I'm actually over-aroused. I'm easily distracted. Now, I could be distracted by another task or just distracted, mind-wandering, what have you. But the important thing is that there's now this relationship between what's happening in the locus coeruleus, what's happening in task performance, and we also believe a relationship in what's happening in terms of the underlying cortical circuitry that's involved in the orienting response, which has typically been associated with this P300. So how are we going to tie all this together? So one thing that I do in my lab is I try to record multimodal neuroimaging data. We use EEG and MRI simultaneously. We also track the pupil, both tracking pupil dilation as well as tracking the eyes. And we kind of use machine learning to fuse these different data sets together to make inferences about underlying patterns of brain activity that could explain some of these phenomena. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time in the challenges of simultaneous EEG fMRI. The bottom line is, you know, fMRI is noisy, EEG is noisy, fMRI EEG is really noisy. The bottom line is that we've come up with a way, building our own system, that mitigates some of the issues of the artifacts that each modality introduces into the other. But ultimately, even if you get a clean signal at the end, how are you going to combine the data? And there's got to be, you know, the loss that one gets in the quality of the signal has to be justified by the need to record these two modalities simultaneously. If there's no real good justification on why they should be recorded at the same time, you might as well record them separately and then integrate them. So within the context of this question about the orienting response and understanding how we might capture that trial-by-trial variability in the EEG and in some sense map it in space and time in the brain, what we do is we go to the EEG and we say, well, what we're going to do is instead of averaging over these trials, as traditionally would be done in ERP literature, we're going to average over space. So we'll have a different set of channel, or let's say a set of channels of 64 to 128 channels, and we're going to build classifiers that discriminate between different conditions. Okay, and we're going to do that as a function of time relative to the stimulus. And these time steps that we take are relatively high temporal resolution. So let's say on the order of 25 milliseconds. So every 25 milliseconds, we build a classifier, and we look at not just the classification performance, but the variability of each trial from the classifier's boundary. And the reason we look at that is that in some sense gives us a measure of the underlying variability on a trial-by-trial basis that is reflected at that time in the EEG. Now, some of that variability could be purely noise, but our hypothesis is that some of that is related to the underlying endogenous arousal state and orienting state. So when we think about and relating let's say, back to our condition here, we would expect these 3 different cases to result in 3 different data points in our space. This is only showing 2 dimensions of EEG. Obviously, we're in like a 64-dimensional space. And by looking at those distances, we can come up with a tag, a special tag or temporal tag that we can regress into the fMRI. So here's an example of a simple experiment that's trying to reflect what that student is dealing with along the way on Broadway. So we have a classic visual oddball experiment. There are these distractor stimuli that the subject more or less ignores. And then there are these target stimuli, these, let's say a red circle that the subject has to pay attention to and respond to. And so we do this task supramodally. We do it in the auditory domain as well as the visual domain. And we measure the EEG. We build these classifiers, like I said, at temporal windows relative to the stimulus. We take that when we use traditional general linear modeling in analyzing our bold data. We put the standard type of regressors that one might put into that type of model, essentially the fact that we know there was a target or a non-target. But what's unique is that we then also put in regressors that are a function of the variability, okay, at different moments in time. So we put these into our model, and from that we can build essentially a model where we tag each voxel by a trial-to-trial variability that also is associated with a given time relative to the stimulus. And so if we do this and we look at the results, the first thing you'll see is that there's an axis here, an x-axis, that's in units of milliseconds, and it's actually pretty high temporal resolution relative to what we think about for fMRI. And that's because we're not using data from the fMRI to get the temporal resolution. We're using the EEG variability and the fact that that variability for a given time window tags these voxels. So we can start to tease apart across the trial the activations of different brain regions. Now, not to go into all the details, but what's important here is if we look at the systems that we find by mapping and tagging with this trial-to-trial variability, and then compare that to the literature, we see expression of networks that have typically been associated with the locus coeruleus norepinephrine system, the P300, as well as the ventral attention network, which is one of the 2 networks that are involved in attentional orienting. Also really kind of cool from our point of view was that if you look at around 450 milliseconds, you see this activity that's in the brainstem. And so that is about a voxel or 2 from the map, the functional or the anatomical map, I should say, of the locus coeruleus. Now, with the type of imaging we did, we can't be sure it's the locus coeruleus. But what is interesting is that it is tagged with variability, and it's tagged with the variability at 450 milliseconds, which is the time of the peak in the P300. So we're starting to see here kind of a set of networks that are related to the orienting response, that are actually relatively broad, span across the brain and in time. So given that as kind of a background and a backdrop, what does all of this have to do with BMI, right, or BCI? So, so now I go to this question of implicitly labeling the world. So now we're walking down Broadway, let's say, and you know, as we walk down Broadway, we have all these kind of these thoughts going on in our head. I think it's the voice in our head that Jack mentioned yesterday, and you know, so we're assessing our environment. Now, I don't think, and I know with current technology in EEG, there's no way we're going to be able to decode that thought, right? Maybe with something like fMRI or something portable, someday we might be able to actually record and decode these specific thoughts. But we can potentially record these orienting events. And so because each one of these thoughts typically has us orienting, not just physically orienting, but orienting our brain's cognitive processes and attention to these stimuli in the world. So what we want to propose is a way to opportunistically sense this attentional orienting, take these labels and use these labels within a machine learning framework to kind of synergistically combine the human and the machine to improve, for lack of a better term, the situational awareness or the overall representation of our environment. So we have our stick man figure somewhere in the world. The beautiful thing with this type of idea is that we're already instrumented in the sense that we've got, other than the EEG, which is obviously not the easiest thing to do at the moment, but we've got GPS associated with us. There's a lot of metadata. We've got cameras on ourselves. And so if an event happens in the world that we orient to, we can potentially, let's say, decode that orienting event and snap a picture, okay? And so that picture that gets snapped is associated with some place in the world that has metadata associated with it. That can then be used as input into a machine learning system, some type of computer vision system, deep neural network, whatever you want to consider. I'll go into an example in a moment. And used essentially to either find similar images in a database, get metadata about what that might be an image of, a class. It could also potentially provide some recommendation relative to where I am in the world, where are other things in the world that are related to that. Okay, so I'm going to walk down the street and all of a sudden I see a Mercedes, and Mercedes is immediately going to give me 10% off at my local Mercedes dealer. We all would love that technology, right? But the point here is we can have still a low bandwidth signal, relatively speaking. I mean, we're not decoding very high bandwidth information, but that's information that's not easily accessible through other means. Behaviorally, we don't want to be, every time we orient to something, press a button. We want to kind of opportunistically sense this. So we started looking at this, and we built an experiment where we used the Unity game engine to build an environment. And in this environment, the idea is a subject was instrumented in the environment with EEG and other sensors. I'll talk about that in a moment. And they had a task where there was a car or a truck in front of them, and that truck would periodically, actually randomly, put on its brakes. And all that subject had to do, it had one control signal it could generate through a button press, was to put on its own brakes so it didn't bump into the car in front of it. But however, at the same time, there was another task that the subject had to execute, but they didn't make any behavioral response. And that was in these little alcoves, if you can see, there are these kind of billboard objects. And before the experiment started, they either were told to look for a particular class of object, or they chose one from their own volition. And all they were supposed to do was, if they saw an object, just note it to themselves. They didn't actually have to do anything anything overtly. So what we did is we extracted, while they were doing this, we had them instrumented with EEG. We were tracking their eyes and their pupil. And we were decoding this information in a fused representation, which I'll talk about. So the first thing is, if you look at the EEG, we had 64 channels. We also had here, this is averaged, this is the pupil dilation, and the two colored curves are between red are the targets that they're interested in, the types of objects, and the blue are all of the non-targets or everything that they weren't interested in. And then this is the dwell time, okay? And so the first thing to note is looks like there's some information in these different signals. The different signals actually they span different kind of time courses. They have different temporal scales. One thing to keep in mind is that if we look at kind of a classic P300 experiment like I showed with the green and the red dots, the amplitudes of those evoked responses are in the these curves I just pop up here, versus what we're seeing in the environment where they're free to move their eyes. They're not moving their body, but it's much less constrained. And you can see that we get a significant reduction in signal to noise when we're in this immersive environment. And the question is, can we still fuse this information in a way to get valuable information that we can use to infer labels for the world? So we build this hierarchical classifier. I'm not going to go into all the details of it. What it does is it essentially integrates across these three different modalities, across the EEG, the pupil dilation, and dwell time. It first analyzes each modality separately in its native space and then combines it into a single output. So it's really a hybrid BCI classifier that we use here. And if we look at that classifier and we look at the constituent inputs into it, one of the important things to note is what the contribution is for decoding this event, this orienting event, relative to the other inputs. So what I've done here is this is with 10 different subjects, ordered those subjects from high to low in terms of the accuracy of the decoding in the EEG. And what you can see is that the EEG for, let's say, the first subject actually does a pretty good job at decoding and detecting this orienting event. And for instance, the dwell time is not particularly good for that subject. However, if you look at subject, I guess it's subject 4, the dwell time is quite good, and in fact it's better for that subject than the EEG is. And so the light blue line that's on the top, it's called, I guess it's the hybrid technique, really rides the envelope of all of these different inputs. So what we see here is that depending on the subject, some of these inputs for the orienting event are more robust than others. And by combining them, not only do we get kind of a better overall prediction of whether there is an orienting event, but we also improve robustness across subjects. So how are we going to use this, though? So now I'm saying we create these labels, right? But how are we going to use this in some smart way to label the world? Well, the key is that we know from those of us in machine learning and kind of how data science has progressed the last 5 years or so, is that labels are valuable commodities, and the more labels we get, the better. And in many cases, even if those labels are wrong, we can use different types of techniques, clustering techniques, to still exploit information from those labels. So what we did is we took a semi-supervised graph-based method as our machine learning model for this particular task. And we said, imagine we can construct a graph in our simulated world. And in that simulated world, this is just a very simple picture of what we are going to actually do in the experiment, but there are these different waypoints. So imagine that these objects are spread throughout the world, okay, and we can make a graph between them. So that graph is just a way to represent the world, but in reality, we're also saying these nodes in the graph are separate in the world. And so what happens is we are allowed to explore a subset of the world, okay? So we can explore, let's say, these 4 nodes, and we can never directly see those 2 nodes during our, let's say, during our experiment. And the question is, well, let's say what I was interested in was these sailboats, okay? So these 2 nodes are labeled, okay? And I can label them either by pressing a button, or I could label them with this predicted orienting signal that I just mentioned. Well, with this kind of construct, this semi-supervised learning, the key idea behind it is it combines clustering with labeling, so that it then starts to make inferences based on the similarity in the feature space in which it's constructed. So let's say in this space it's some classic, image processing features. in where these objects are represented. So these two sailboats get linked to this third sailboat because they share features in common. And we now have a new graph after that labeling where we now have three things clustered together. Two things that I saw through my exercise or exploration of the environment, and another one that's outside of that. So I've extrapolated outside, and I could now recommend to myself or the subject to go and explore that particular location in the world. So this is essentially what we did in this experiment and sets of experiments. This is a top-down view of this simulated city. So each one of these, it's going to be hard to see. I'll have another picture in a minute where it'll be a little easier, but the idea is that there's little red dots that indicate targets of interest. Blue are the distractors. Subjects explore a small part of the space. So that's labeled in gray. We then use our orienting detector to actually label spots in the world based on the output of the detector and what we think they oriented to. We then put that into our graph, which then through the transductive inference takes that information, propagates it across the graph, and then just as a last little trick, we use a route planning tool based on that model of the world, and what we want to do is see if in fact we can now create a map specific to that individual such that they can go and explore the world and see additional things that they would have not seen before with a minimal path link. And so here's just a little demo. This is actually after learning a classifier and testing it in a piece of the city. So anything where you see a little red circle is a new target location that they had not seen before, but that was a result of extrapolating a label that was measured at some other position. And you'll see there are some little X's. Those are places that were actually part of the training data. So they actually saw that before, and that information is used to train the classifier. And what you can see, you know, we chose a good example here, but that it plans a route where most of the objects of interest are actually explored, and they're explored in a way where the alternative, let's say, to mow the lawn or go back and forth would be kind of the obvious thing to do if you had no idea where these objects were. In this particular case, you can use this information to extrapolate and make these inferences. So two other things before I finish. One is the precision. So if we look at what this approach does, the approach says, all right, I'm going to opportunistically sense from the individual this orienting process, and then from that use the machine learning to do two things. So one is to extrapolate. Okay, so one is to say I've seen only this fraction of the world, extrapolate it to other parts of the world. The other thing that we do is we use it to improve the precision of the system. And what do I mean by that? Well, so if we look at the first graph, the precision, just by looking at the accuracy, or actually in this case it is the precision, so it's the positive predictive value across these 10 subjects, just using the output of the hybrid BCI orienting predictor, we see this large variation across these 10 subjects. In fact, in some cases, if we look at relative to chance performance here, which is around 22%, there are a lot of subjects that, in fact, are pretty poor. And the question is, well, why is that? Well, there are false positives that are generated by our decoder. We know that there are false positives just because the decoder is not good. There are sometimes orienting events that somebody has that are either unrelated to the target of interest, or that something looks like it could have been a target of interest and they oriented to it and it got incorrectly classified by the decoder. The point, though, is that if we take those labels and we put that into our semi-supervised machine learning system, that system can help tune and clean up false positives from the human. And how is that? Well, it's operating actually on a different space, a different representational space than the human is. So when it thinks of, okay, I'm getting an input, a potential label into my model, it has an objective function, and it's trying to do two things. It's trying to cluster things together, and it's trying to propagate these labels. So let's say I get a label in that's a false positive. So I'm looking for sailboats, and for whatever reason I orient to you know, something that represents somebody laying on the beach. Okay, so in that space, if I take these features in which they are constructed based on the images, they're very different in that space. So for instance, the features on the beach, very different than the sailboat. Therefore, that's going to change the objective function value in a way that, let's say, makes it worse. And that will then cause the algorithm to spit out that label, because adding that label in just makes the fit to the model worse. So you can basically do a tuning process where you take your top labels, use those as input to the machine learning, and the machine learning then tunes based on how consistent those labels are in its own representation. So that's one thing that we learn from this, in addition to the extrapolation. The other thing that we learn is that there are some times where the HBCI, the output of the decoder, is so bad that there's a catastrophic effect, right? So if you look at that, the brown, the subject that has a brown coloring there, you'll notice that we go from, you know, a higher precision to, after we integrate it into the computer vision or machine learning, it gets worse. So there are cases where if the labeling is too inaccurate, the system can't recover from that. And that's, I think, something that we're looking at characterizing a little bit more closely. Okay, so in summary, what I've been talking about here is basically this notion of looking at these relatively strong macroscopic type signals that we can measure with EEG, can measure non-invasively even today, that are related to attentional orienting and how we process information in the world, kind of get some background into the underlying cortical and subcortical networks that are the basis for this orienting, and then develop these paradigms to explore ways in which we can actually use this as an opportunistic signal that can be put into a BMI, and in a way where it can help in some sense labeling the world based on things that we find of interest. Now, what we're doing right now is we're also doing some of this in virtual reality. So some of our recent work, we're tracking the eyes, measuring the EEG, all within a virtual world. One of the interesting things there is, of course, it's a little challenging in terms of getting the rig set up, but once it is, it's much more immersive, and in fact, the orienting is much stronger. So what we've seen, that even though you have maybe more movement in the case of that type of system, the evoked responses are much stronger. So you get an increase in the underlying signal-to-noise ratio. And then ultimately what we're trying to do sometime in the future, when we've got augmented reality, is create a system where as we walk down the street, we're getting essentially little pieces of information annotated as we orient to events. And so this concept, I think, even though it's somewhat sci-fi, is not it's not implausible, and it's perhaps one of the types of BMI systems that could be useful to people that are otherwise neurologically healthy. Of course, you have to have an off switch, because this could drive you crazy, I guess, after a while. So with that, I'll just thank my collaborators and students, in particular the two students who did most of this work, Jen Waltz, who's now a postdoc at Stanford, and Dave Jangraw, who's a postdoc at NIH. Thanks.
Okay. Now, because time is short, I'd like to ask Paul to step down and you take questions while the panelists come up and the technicians will load your slides in the computer. So